cold November evening in Chicago, Shaquille O'Neal stood tall in a sharp, tailored suit. After attending a charity event, he chose to walk back to his hotel, quietly taking in the city's rhythm, the hurried footsteps, the distant wail of car horns echoing through the streets. He had just left the event, and, instead of taking a car, decided to walk and soak in the crisp night air. Chicago at night always had a unique allure, but tonight, something unsettled him. As he passed a street corner near Millennium Park, he slowed down. There, huddled against a cold brick wall, sat a woman, her frail figure nearly swallowed by layers of tattered, worn-out clothing. Her thin, trembling hands clutched a faded cardboard sign, the black marker letters barely legible. Veteran in need. Please help. Shaq stood still. Around him, the city moved on. Office workers hurried home, couples strolled hand in hand, tourists snapped photos of the skyline. Some glanced at the woman, a few with pity, others with indifference, as if she were nothing more than a fixture of the street, an insignificant fragment of the urban landscape. But Shaq couldn't just walk past. A strong gust of wind swept through, rustling a few dry leaves along the sidewalk. The woman shivered and pulled her ragged coat tighter around herself. Shaq stopped. This feeling, it was eerily familiar. Memories flooded his mind. His childhood years as a towering, impoverished boy growing up in the tough streets of Newark, New Jersey. His mother, Lucille, had worked tirelessly to raise him, sometimes juggling 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. There were nights when they barely had enough for a single meal, nights when she sacrificed her own portion just so he wouldn't go hungry. He remembered walking with her through the freezing winter streets, his small hand gripping hers as she quietly worried about whether they had enough money to buy food. He remembered one particular evening as a young boy when he saw a homeless man curled up under the awning of a storefront. His mother had taken off her own sweater and handed it to the man, even though she was already shivering from the cold. When Shaq had asked her why she did it, she had simply said, "Because if you can help someone, you should." And now, standing here in the biting November wind, he saw before him a woman, freezing, defeated, her eyes empty with despair. A veteran, someone who had once served this country, now abandoned on the streets, without shelter, without a helping hand. Shaq swallowed hard. As a man who had reached the heights of fame and success, he knew that not everyone was fortunate enough to get a second chance. He could easily keep walking, just like everyone else. But was that the right thing to do? He couldn't ignore her. He couldn't just step past as if she were invisible. Shaq took a deep breath and stepped forward. Shaq crouched down, his towering frame casting a shadow over the frail, shivering woman. He didn't want to startle her, but Rachel Carter flinched anyway, her eyes flashing with wariness. She instinctively pulled her tattered coat tighter around her, as if it were the only shield she had left. "Hey," Shaq said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Shaq. What's your name?" Rachel hesitated, as if she had grown too used to being ignored, to being just another invisible figure in the city's background. "Rachel Carter," she finally answered. Shaq nodded, his tone warm and patient. "You served in the military?" Rachel gave a small nod, her voice hoarse from the cold. 12 years in the Marine Corps. I was injured in an explosion while on duty in Afghanistan. After I was discharged, things got hard." She paused, as if reluctant to say more, but Shaq's gaze remained steady, not with pity, not with judgment, but with genuine concern. She took a slow breath, as if gathering the strength to continue. "When I first came home, I thought I'd be okay. I had a plan. I had a small apartment on the west side. I had a job, but I was wrong. When I was no longer a soldier, when I wasn't wearing the uniform, when I wasn't holding a rifle for this country, nobody cared who I was anymore. Shaq looked down at the worn-out cardboard sign in front of her, its message smudged by the dampness of the street. A woman who had given her youth to the military, now forgotten on the sidewalk, swallowed by the indifference of the world. "When did you lose everything?" he asked quietly. Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh. 3 years ago, maybe longer. When I left the military, I thought I could start over. I followed the plan. I did everything right. But this system doesn't have a place for people like me. She had worked for a private security firm, hoping to put her military skills to use. But they didn't want a veteran with a permanent back injury. When she failed the rigorous physical exams, they let her go. She tried finding another job, but no one wanted to hire a disabled soldier, a woman who had been on the battlefield, carrying scars both seen and unseen. She could see it in their eyes, even before they spoke. A hesitation, an unspoken discomfort, a pause before they said, "We'll be in touch." But the call never came. Shaq listened in silence, each of her words cutting deep. He understood now. There was no single villain in Rachel's story. It was a system that had chewed her up and spit her out. A society that had discarded her like an obsolete tool. The banks wouldn't lend her money after she lost her job. The landlord kicked her out after she missed 1 month's rent, and employers didn't want to take a chance on someone with her past. The endless rejections, the slammed doors, the empty promises, each one pushing her further down until there was nothing left of the life she had once built. Rachel clenched her fingers, her thin hands pale from the cold. "Do you know what the worst part is, Shaq?" He didn't answer, just waited for her to go on. She looked up at him, and this time her eyes held no suspicion, only the emptiness of someone who had lost everything. "It's not the hunger. It's not the cold. It's the feeling that no one remembers you exist." Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He couldn't begin to imagine that feeling, to be forgotten, to be erased. He had spent his life surrounded by crowds, by flashing cameras, by millions of people chanting his name. But what if one day no one remembered Shaquille O'Neal? What if he faded into the city, nothing more than another nameless face, just like Rachel? The thought alone made it hard to breathe. He met her gaze, and he didn't see a homeless woman. He didn't see a failure. He didn't see someone to pity. He saw a warrior who had been abandoned. Someone who had once stood at the edge of life and death, stronger than most, but who had been pushed to society's margins, left to disappear without a trace. "Is there no one who can help you?" he asked. Rachel shook her head, exhaustion in her voice. "No one." Shaq glanced around. The city carried on, oblivious. No one stopped. No one noticed. He took a deep breath, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out his phone. Rachel frowned, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "What are you doing?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He dialed a number, his voice firm as he spoke. "Margaret, I need a hotel room, right now, and a doctor. This is important." "Who is this for?" Margaret asked, confused. Shaq looked at Rachel, his voice steady. "Someone who should have never been on the street in the first place." He closed the phone, then turned back to her. "Stand up. Come with me." Rachel narrowed her eyes, still hesitant. "Are you serious?" Shaq didn't waver. "Yes, because someone should have done this a long time ago. She hesitated, still uncertain, still not quite daring to believe. But for the first time in years, the faintest glimmer of hope flickered in her eyes, and she decided to trust him. Shaq took a deep breath, the icy Chicago air filling his lungs, but he no longer cared about the cold. He couldn't just walk away like everyone else, couldn't pretend he didn't see a human being slowly being erased by society. Rachel Carter wasn't just a shadow on the sidewalk. She was a veteran. She had fought, she had sacrificed, she had faced dangers most people couldn't even imagine. And now she had been left behind, not by fate, but by a system that had never truly cared for people like her. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of Margaret Jackson, his longtime assistant. His voice was firm, leaving no room for hesitation. "Margaret, I need a hotel room immediately. Find a doctor to check on a veteran. This is important." Margaret didn't ask questions. She knew Shaq well. If he said something was important, then it truly was. "I'm on it, Shaq." He ended the call and turned back to Rachel. She was still curled up, still instinctively making herself small as if shrinking enough would make her invisible to the world. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Rachel looked up, her gray-blue eyes still holding a trace of doubt. She had been betrayed, abandoned too many times to trust easily, even if the man in front of her was Shaquille O'Neal, a name everyone knew. But there was no pity in his voice, no hollow charity, no false kindness meant to make himself feel better. There was only certainty, a quiet, unwavering determination she hadn't seen in anyone in years. For the first time, she gave a small nod. The black SUV that Margaret arranged arrived sooner than expected, pulling up to the curb with its engine still running. The driver stepped out, politely opening the door. Shaq extended his hand toward Rachel, a silent invitation. But she didn't move. Shaq saw the conflict in her eyes, the battle between wanting to trust and the fear of being let down again. She had trusted people before. She had believed someone would help her before. But all she had ever received were empty promises, pitying looks, and then cold indifference. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was quiet but not weak. Shaq didn't answer right away. He understood that this wasn't just a simple question. She wasn't just asking about his actions. She was asking about his motives, about the real reason behind all of this. Because someone should have done this a long time ago. His answer wasn't poetic, wasn't elaborate, but it was honest. And that was what made Rachel reach out and take his hand. As she stood, Shaq noticed the way people around them started to look. A tall, wealthy, famous man helping a homeless woman into a luxury SUV. Some eyes were filled with curiosity, some with pity, but others weren't so kind. A middle-aged couple walked past. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, just low enough to think no one would hear, but loud enough that Rachel did. Probably just another junkie getting lucky. Rachel stiffened, her fingers gripping the car door tightly. She was used to words like that. She had heard them too many times. So many that she had almost started to believe them. That everything that had happened was her fault. That she deserved this life. Shaq turned sharply, his expression darkening with anger. But instead of arguing, he simply said one thing, slow and deliberate. "She fought for this country. She deserves better." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. Her husband tugged her away before Shaq could say anything more. Rachel said nothing, but she got into the car, The SUV rolled forward, leaving behind the cold streets, leaving behind the judgmental stares. Rachel sat still, hands clasped together, her gaze fixed on the window but not really seeing anything. She couldn't remember the last time she had been in a warm car. Shaq watched her from the seat beside her. "Are you okay?" She nodded but didn't speak. He understood. No one easily believes that life can change in a single night. The car pulled up to a high-end hotel in the heart of the city. Rachel swallowed hard as she looked at the elegant entrance, the golden glow of the lights spilling out from inside. She glanced down at her ragged clothes, then back at Shaq. "I don't think they'll let me in." Shaq smiled. "They will. You're my guest." He stepped out first, holding the door open for her. Rachel hesitated, then slowly followed. A hotel staff member quickly approached, his polite smile barely hiding his curiosity as he looked between Shaq and Rachel. "Mr. O'Neill, we have prepared the room as requested. Is there anything else you need?" Shaq placed a gentle hand on Rachel's back, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. "Make sure she has everything she needs." The staff member nodded, then led them inside. Rachel walked through the hotel doors, every step a battle against the voices in her head telling her she didn't belong here, that she didn't deserve this. But as the doors closed behind her, shutting out the cold, it felt like she was stepping into a different world. For the first time in years, she didn't have to wonder where she would sleep tonight. Shaq looked at her, and his expression wasn't one of a man who had done a good deed. It was the expression of someone who understood that this was just the beginning. "You're not sleeping on the street ever again." Rachel met his gaze, and for the first time since they met, she smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a forced one, but a real, small, genuine smile. Because for the first time in a long time, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Rachel sat on a bench outside the hotel, the cold still clinging to her skin, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel consumed by it. She wasn't curled up in fear of the night. She wasn't dreading the darkness. She still couldn't fully believe this was real, that she was sitting here, waiting for something good instead of waiting for another disaster to strike. Shaq watched her, noticing how her hands still trembled from hunger and cold. Without a word, he strode across the street to a small food stand. A few minutes later, he returned, placing a steaming bowl of soup and a sandwich into her hands. Rachel looked up at him, startled, as if she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care. "Eat," Shaq said. It wasn't a command, but it left no room for refusal. Rachel wrapped her freezing fingers around the warm bowl, savoring the heat against her skin. She inhaled deeply, the scent of hot soup stirring a hunger that had long been dulled. She lifted the spoon to her lips and took a sip. Shaq saw the slightest shift in her expression, a flicker of relief, a moment where she allowed herself to enjoy something without guilt. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" Shaq asked, his voice soft but filled with real concern. Rachel hesitated, as if trying to recall. Then she simply shook her head. "I don't remember." That simple answer clenched something in Shaq's chest. She had gone hungry for so long that the idea of a proper meal had become a distant memory. It wasn't just about food. It was about the loss of something deeper, the feeling of being cared for, of being acknowledged as a human being who deserved even the most basic things. Rachel ate slowly, not because she wanted to, but because her stomach had been empty for so long that it couldn't handle too much too fast. Shaq didn't rush her. He just stood by her side watching her, realizing that helping someone wasn't just about giving them food or shelter. It was about making them feel seen, reminding them that they still mattered. At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled up. The driver stepped out, quickly opening the door. Shaq turned to Rachel. "Let's go." Rachel remained still, staring at the car. She hadn't been inside a vehicle like this since losing everything. To her, it felt like a carriage from another world, a world she no longer belonged to. "I can't," she whispered. "Why?" Shaq asked. Rachel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Do you really think a hotel room and a hot meal are going to fix everything? That I'll wake up tomorrow and my life will magically be different?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Then he shook his head. "Number, I don't." Rachel waited, expecting him to say more. Shaq knelt slightly so their eyes were level. "I can't change your entire life overnight, but I can help you start again." Rachel opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she stopped. She was used to rejecting help, used to not trusting anyone. But this time, she couldn't find a reason to refuse. She swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. Shaq smiled, standing up as he extended a hand. "Come on." Rachel hesitated for just a second, then reached out and let him help her to her feet. As she stepped into the car, she didn't look back at the street she had come from, because this wasn't just a ride to a hotel. This was the first step toward finding herself again. The SUV pulled away, leaving behind the cold sidewalk and carrying with it a woman who had once been forgotten, until tonight. The driver stepped out and opened the car door. Rachel stared at the luxury SUV, her gray-blue eyes reflecting the dim glow of the street lights. She turned to Shaq, her lips pressing together as if weighing something heavy in her mind. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Shaq met her gaze unwavering. He crouched slightly, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, not forceful, but firm enough for her to feel the certainty and sincerity behind his words. Because someone should have done this a long time ago. Rachel held her breath for a moment. She didn't know how to respond because those words, though simple, contained something she had long yearned for. Recognition. Not pity, not charity, but an acknowledgement that she should never have ended up like this in the first place. She inhaled deeply, then stepped into the car. As the door shut behind her, an unfamiliar sensation settled over her. Warmth. How long had it been since she felt warmth like this? The plush leather seat cradled her back, no icy wind cutting through her clothes, no relentless howling in her ears. She looked down at her hands that, just minutes ago, had been wrapped around a steaming bowl of soup on the sidewalk. Now they rested against the polished, pristine surface of a luxury vehicle. She didn't belong here. The thought struck immediately. She had grown too accustomed to being on the margins, too used to existing in the spaces where people only saw through her, not at her. Now, she was inside a vehicle that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life, and she couldn't stop herself from wondering, was this just a fleeting dream? The car pulled away from the curb, weaving into the city streets. Rachel remained silent, eyes fixed on the window. The street lights blurred past, the familiar roads of Chicago morphing into something distant, foreign. She watched people moving through their routines, warmly dressed couples strolling past decorated storefronts, restaurant patrons laughing over candlelit dinners, sharply dressed professionals walking with confident strides, their shoes untouched by the grime of the streets. This world had once been hers. Now, it felt as distant as a memory from another lifetime. Shaq observed her from the seat beside her. He didn't speak, didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances. He knew that change, especially for someone who had been cast aside for so long, wouldn't come in a single night. Trust couldn't be rebuilt in a matter of hours. Not when the world had taught her, over and over, that trust was a dangerous thing to have. "Have you ever been in a car like this before?" Shaq finally asked, his voice deep but devoid of judgment. Rachel kept her gaze on the passing cityscape. A faint smile flickered across her lips, but it wasn't one of joy. "Yeah," she murmured, "the day I came back from Afghanistan." Shaq frowned slightly. Rachel continued, her voice steady, but her eyes revealed the storm she carried inside. "We landed at the airbase. When I stepped off the plane, there was a luxury car waiting to take us to the city, to a ceremony honoring returning soldiers. There were flags, handshakes, speeches." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "And then what? When the ceremony ended, when the crowd dispersed, when the hands stopped shaking and the words of gratitude were spoken." She turned to face Shaq, and for the first time her eyes weren't hollow. They were sharp, edged with resentment. "They handed me a folder on how to reintegrate into civilian life, a list of organizations that might help me find a job, a smile, and then they walked away." Shaq clenched his jaw. He could picture it clearly. A flashy ceremony, empty words from people who had never seen war, meaningless pats on the back, and then nothing. A soldier returning from combat only to find that, beyond the spectacle, no one really cared how she would survive after. Rachel took another slow breath, turning her gaze back to the window. "So, yeah, I've been in a car like this before, but when the event was over, I had to find my own way home." Shaq didn't respond right away. He let her words settle, let the silence in the car absorb the painful truth she had spoken. "This time will be different," he finally said, his voice resolute. Rachel didn't look at him, but he saw the way her fingers curled into themselves, gripping tightly against the fabric of her worn-out jacket. The car rolled to a stop in front of a high-end hotel in the heart of the city. Rachel glanced through the window, suspicion flashing in her eyes. She saw polished leather shoes stepping across gleaming marble floors, sharp suits and tailored dresses, hotel staff in pristine uniforms moving seamlessly through the lobby. A world she had once belonged to, a world that now felt impossibly out of reach. She turned to Shaq. "I can't go in there." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Look at me, Shaq. Look at what I'm wearing. Do I look like someone who walks into places like that? They won't even let me pass the front door." Shaq smiled, unwavering. "They will, because you're my guest." He stepped out of the car first, extending a hand toward her. Rachel stared at his hand, then at the hotel, then down at herself. Once again, she could hear the voice in her head whispering, "This isn't for you. You don't belong here." But then she remembered his words. Because someone should have done this a long time ago. She inhaled deeply, then placed her hand in his, stepping out of the car. The moment they entered the hotel, eyes turned toward them. Some were merely curious, others were judgmental, a few held thinly veiled disdain. But Shaq didn't acknowledge any of them, and for the first time in years, Rachel chose not to care. As they crossed the grand lobby, warmth wrapped around her. No bitter wind, no cold pavement beneath her feet, No indifferent stares of passing strangers. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't bracing herself to be turned away. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just another homeless person blending into the city's shadows. She was a human being. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe she still deserved to be treated like one. The hotel doors shut behind them, sealing off the outside world. Rachel felt as if she had stepped into another life, one she had long forgotten. No howling wind, no concrete bed, no avoiding the eyes of those who walked past without a second glance. Instead, chandeliers glowed overhead, polished marble reflected their footsteps, and the air carried the faint scent of oak and fresh flowers. Rachel slowed her steps. Her torn sneakers, her threadbare clothes, they didn't belong here. But beside her, Shaq walked with effortless confidence, completely unbothered by the curious glances from the hotel staff and guests. At the front desk, a poised receptionist greeted Shaq with a practiced smile. But when her gaze shifted to Rachel, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Shaq didn't give her time to question anything. "She's my guest. Where's the room I requested?" His voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for debate. The receptionist straightened, her professionalism taken over. "Yes, Mr. O'Neill. Everything is ready. Penthouse suite, top floor. We've also arranged for all requested amenities." Rachel turned to Shaq, confusion in her expression. "You planned this ahead of time?" Shaq simply shrugged. "I knew Margaret would handle things quickly, and I wanted to make sure you had somewhere proper to rest." "Margaret?" Rachel didn't know much about Shaq's assistant, but if she had set all this up in such a short time, she must have been incredibly efficient. "This way, Ms. Carter." The receptionist gestured toward the elevators. Rachel hesitated, then followed. Shaq remained beside her, never letting her fall behind. As they entered the elevator, Rachel caught sight of herself in the mirrored walls. For the first time in a long time, she saw herself the way others did. A frail figure in ragged clothing, her face gaunt, her hair unkempt, her body weighed down by years of neglect. She clenched her fists, shame rising in her throat. Shaq noticed the tension in her shoulders. He didn't say much, just rested a large, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not on the streets anymore, Rachel." She met his eyes through the reflection, and for the first time, she almost believed him. Rachel sat on the spacious sofa in the suite, feeling the unfamiliar softness beneath the clean fabric. How long had it been since she felt something that wasn't hard, cold, or unyielding? She wasn't used to this space. Everything here felt foreign compared to the years she had spent on the streets. Dr. Eleanor Finch had examined her, prescribed some pain medication for her old back injury, along with vitamins to help with malnutrition. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she had seen a doctor, but she knew that some wounds ran deeper than just physical pain. The greatest wound she carried couldn't be healed with medicine or surgery. It was the belief that she no longer deserved a second chance. A knock at the door startled her. She tensed instinctively, but Shaq had already risen from his seat, motioning for her to stay calm. When the door opened, a woman in her 40s, with short, pale blonde hair, stepped in alongside Margaret. She wore a simple but professional suit, her petite frame carrying an air of quiet confidence and authority. Lisa Turner, a representative from Veterans United Support Services, an organization dedicated to helping veterans reintegrate into society. "Rachel Carter?" Lisa approached her, extending a hand. Rachel took it, feeling the firm, steady grip. It had been a long time since she shook hands with someone out of genuine respect. Lisa smiled warmly, her voice carrying both compassion and professionalism. "We've heard about your situation. I want you to know, you're not alone." Rachel narrowed her eyes slightly. "Are you sure about that? Because I've been alone for a long time." Lisa pulled a chair over and sat across from Rachel, her gaze unwavering, neither avoiding her nor pitying her. "That feeling is real. I won't deny that, but it's not the only truth." Rachel folded her arms, still guarded. "How can you help me?" Lisa opened her briefcase, pulling out a folder and placing it on the table in front of Rachel. "We can help you find stable housing, a job that fits your skills, and any support you need to get back on your feet. But most importantly, we won't let you do it alone." Rachel stared at the folder, not touching it yet. Shaq remained beside her, not pushing her, but Rachel could feel the weight of his quiet encouragement. He had pulled her off the cold sidewalk, but this, starting over, had to be her choice. "Can I really start over?" Her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something more fragile. Lisa nodded, her smile no longer just professional, it was an earnest reassurance. "Absolutely. But it won't be easy, and it requires you to believe that you deserve a better life." Rachel let out a dry chuckle. "I've been on the streets for 3 years. I don't believe in easy." Lisa smiled. "Good, because neither do I. I believe in what's worth fighting for." Rachel was quiet for a few moments before finally reaching out. She picked up the folder and opened it, scanning the pages. Inside were detailed resources: temporary housing, mental health counseling, job training, employment opportunities specifically for veterans. Things she had never imagined she could have access to. But now, they were right in front of her, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she still had a chance. Rachel flipped through the documents, her gray-blue eyes moving across the words, but her mind was struggling to process everything. It was too much, too fast, too unbelievable. A part of her still couldn't grasp the idea that her life could change overnight. Shaq sat beside her, watching. He understood this feeling, the feeling of someone who had lived in the dark for so long that when the light finally came, they didn't trust it, and he knew that this was the moment that would determine whether Rachel would take this chance or let it slip away. Lisa's voice was calm but persuasive. "We can have a temporary housing unit ready for you as early as tomorrow. It'll be your own space, safe, stable. No more nights on the sidewalk, no more worrying about your next meal. From there, we'll work on finding a job that fits your skills and current situation." Rachel gripped the edge of the folder, her throat tightening. For years, she had believed that no one cared, that the world had long since forgotten her. But now, Shaq, Lisa, and an entire organization were presenting her with a different reality. "So, if I agree, all of this will really happen?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might cause it all to disappear. Lisa nodded. "You just have to be willing to start. The rest, we'll do together." Rachel looked down at the table, her thoughts spinning. Then she glanced at Shaq, searching for some kind of final confirmation. And that was when Shaq made a decision. He wasn't just going to help her start over, he was going to make sure she had a real chance. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table in front of her. Rachel frowned, confused, until Shaq pushed it toward her. "This covers your rent for the first year," he said, his voice unwavering. "So, you'll have time to get settled without worrying about losing your home again." Rachel froze. "What?" Shaq didn't give her time to react before placing a second envelope on the table. "And this is a check, to help with anything you need right now. Not for luxuries, but so you can start fresh with dignity. Buy what you need, not just what you're forced to accept." Rachel stared at the two envelopes, barely breathing. She blinked several times, her chest rising and falling unevenly. "You don't have to do this." Her voice cracked. Shaq smiled, but there was no pity in his eyes, no condescension, only unshakable belief. "I don't have to. I want to." Rachel felt something tighten in her throat, a feeling she couldn't name, something between gratitude, disbelief, and the painful remnants of a lifetime of disappointment. She had spent years believing no one in the world would ever help her without expecting something in return. She had spent years thinking that once you fell, you were on your own, because no one would ever reach out to pull you back up. But this man, a basketball legend, a successful businessman, a global icon, had just shattered everything she thought she knew about the indifference of the world. Rachel shook her head, trying to push back the burning in her eyes. "Why? Why are you doing all of this for me?" Shaq met her gaze, his voice steady and clear. "Because I know you didn't deserve what happened to you, and because I believe you can stand up again." Rachel bit her lip, turning away as a single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but Shaq had already seen it. Lisa's smile was full of both understanding and hope. "Ms. Carter, trust me. You can rebuild your life, and this time you won't have to do it alone." Rachel looked back at the envelopes, hesitated for just a second, then reached out, her fingers brushing against them before finally picking them up. She took a deep breath and turned to Shaq. He didn't rush her. He didn't pressure her. But in his eyes there was something more powerful than money or generosity. There was real faith in her. And for the first time in years, Rachel decided that maybe, just maybe, she should try believing in herself again. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Rachel blinked a few times, slowly becoming aware of the quiet around her. No honking cars, no biting cold, no crushing sense of abandonment. She still wasn't used to this. It took her a moment to realize she was no longer lying on the freezing concrete of some forgotten street, but instead on a soft bed, wrapped in a blanket thick enough to keep out the night's chill. She inhaled deeply, the crisp, clean air filling her lungs, not the usual mix of exhaust fumes and the stench of garbage she had grown accustomed to. She had a place to stay. Turning onto her side, Rachel glanced out the window. From here, she could see the city stretching before her, the same Chicago that had once felt like an unrelenting force against her, now looking like an open door to a second chance. She had never imagined having the opportunity to start over. But now, it was right in front of her. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She tensed slightly out of habit, but quickly reminded herself she wasn't on the streets anymore. She didn't have to be on edge every time she heard a noise. She got up and walked to the door. Shaq stood there, towering as always, his familiar warm smile greeting her. "Good morning," he said, his deep voice carrying an easy energy. "Did you sleep well?" Rachel nodded lightly. "Better than I expected." Shaq chuckled. "Good. You'll need all the energy you can get for what's ahead." Rachel knew he was right. Today, she would be meeting with representatives from Veterans United Support Services, finalizing the paperwork for her long-term housing, and enrolling in a job training program designed for veterans. Most importantly, today marked the true beginning of a life she once thought was completely out of reach. She took a deep breath, feeling a small wave of nervous anticipation. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was hope. Shaq watched her for a moment, then his voice turned more serious. "I'll be heading out soon, but before I go, I need you to promise me something." Rachel looked at him, waiting. "When you can, help someone else." His words settled into the quiet room like a weight far heavier than sound. Rachel had once been forgotten, had once believed she no longer mattered. But today, someone had reached out, had lifted her up, had reminded her that she was still worthy of being here. And now, Shaq was asking her to do the same for someone else. One day, when she was strong enough. Rachel met his gaze. For the first time in years, she wasn't consumed by the darkness of her past. She nodded firmly. "I promise." Shaq smiled, satisfied. He didn't need to say anything else. He knew she would keep that promise. Then he stepped out of the room, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts. But this time, she wasn't afraid of the silence. This time, she had a future waiting for her. Rachel stood at the window, watching as Shaq walked away from the hotel and disappeared into the bustling morning crowd. His broad shoulders squared against the cold wind, his steps steady and purposeful, as if nothing in the world could shake him. She had met many kinds of people in her life, those who made empty promises and forgot them, those who pretended to care but only out of pity, and those who saw people like her as nothing more than burdens. But Shaq was different. He hadn't just helped her. He had believed in her. He hadn't given her a chance because he felt sorry for her. He had given her a chance because he knew she still had value. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. A hotel staff member passed by, barely glancing at her before going about their duties. Rachel realized something in that moment. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just another ghost on the sidewalk that people avoided eye contact with. She was here. She existed. But there was still uncertainty, a lingering doubt resting somewhere in her chest. Could this really last? Could she truly be strong enough to hold on to this chance and make it mean something? She watched as Shaq's figure disappeared into the city. Rachel pressed her lips together. Number. She couldn't afford to doubt herself now. Shaq had believed in her. Lisa Turner from Veterans United Support Services had believed in her, and now she had to learn to believe in herself. Rachel took a deep breath. One day, she would pay this kindness forward. One day, she would be on the other side of this moment, reaching out to help someone just like her, because someone had done it for her. She stepped away from the window, but this time she walked with purpose. Rachel was no longer a homeless woman. She was no longer a forgotten shadow drifting through the crowded streets of Chicago. She was no longer someone the world had given up on. She had a chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Her story wasn't just about receiving help, it was about the power of compassion. In just a few hours, a woman who had lost everything found hope again. But, more importantly, she wasn't just taking this opportunity. She was making the decision to turn it into something meaningful. Rachel sat at the small desk in her room and reopened the folder from Veterans United Support Services. The words on the pages were no longer abstract concepts. They were the roadmap to her new life. A stable home, counseling services for veterans, job training, career opportunities, a future. But the most important part of this journey wasn't written in those documents. It was in the choice she was about to make. She took a deep breath. For so long, she had believed her life was over. She had believed no one in the world cared about what happened to her. She had convinced herself she didn't matter. But Shaq had changed that. Not just with money or charity, but with something far more powerful. He had trusted her. He hadn't seen a homeless woman. He had seen a warrior who had once stood on the battlefield. He had seen a human being who deserved a second chance. And because of that, he had pulled her back from the edge of hopelessness. Shaquille O'Neal didn't walk away. He had stopped when the rest of the world kept walking past. He had extended a hand when she had stopped believing anyone would. And because of that single moment, a life had changed forever. Rachel let out a slow breath and smiled. A small smile, but one full of meaning. One day, when she was strong enough, she would do the same for someone else. Because someone had done it for her. Rachel Carter's story is proof that a single act of kindness can change an entire life. If Shaquille O'Neal had been like everyone else, if he had just walked past her without stopping, Rachel might still be on the cold streets of Chicago today. But because of one moment of compassion, a door to a new life was opened. Too often, we are caught up in our own lives, but sometimes a simple gesture, a look of understanding, an outstretched hand, can change someone's fate. What do you think about this story? If you were in Shaq's position, would you have stopped to help? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories in the future. See you in the next video.